The night was cold and quiet as the streets of Silver Creek, a small town in Ohio, lay under a blanket of fog. The soft hum of a passing car broke the silence, only to be replaced by the sudden screech of tires. In the distance, headlights cut through the mist, illuminating the scene that would leave the community shocked for days to come. A body was lying motionless on the road, a dark pool of blood slowly spreading out around it. The car that had hit her was still there, its engine idling, headlights blinding any witnesses who dare to approach. A man stood beside the car, his face expressionless, staring at the scene with an eerie calm. His hands were trembling, but his eyes were cold, almost distant. Detective James Donovan arrived on the scene within minutes. He had worked enough years in law enforcement to recognize a case that would shake him to his core. He stepped out of his vehicle, the gravel crunching beneath his boots, and approached the officers already gathered around the body. "Who is she?" Donovan asked, his voice steady. "Her name is Carla Simmons," one of the officers replied. "We're still waiting on the coroner to confirm, but it looks like she was hit by the car, pretty brutally from the way she was thrown. The car was registered to her husband, Lieutenant John Simmons, a U.S. Army officer." Donovan's interest peaked as he surveyed the scene. "What's the story here?" "Carla and John were having marital problems, sir. Neighbors heard shouting earlier tonight. Some say they saw her leaving their house in a rush. Then the crash happened. We think she was walking away from their home when she was hit." Donovan frowned. A domestic dispute, an angry confrontation, and now a brutal death. He had seen too many cases like this before, but something about the whole situation felt off. There was more to this than a simple hit and run. The coroner arrived shortly, confirming that Carla had been struck by the car at high speed. Her injuries were severe, and it was clear she had not survived. Donovan's mind started working overtime as he began piecing together the potential motive behind the crash. "What happened between them?" Donovan asked again. "Neighbors mentioned that Carla had been acting strange for a few weeks," the officer explained. "She was distant, almost like she was hiding something. John was a respected soldier, but he was always away on deployments. We don't know much about their relationship, but something tells me this isn't as simple as it seems." Donovan's instincts told him there was more to this. As he looked at the body, the faint traces of makeup on her face smeared by the impact, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a random accident. Something about it was personal. "Bring him in," Donovan ordered. "I want to speak with John Simmons." Lieutenant John Simmons was still at home when the call came in. He hadn't even had the chance to process what had happened, what he had done. The police were asking for him to come down to the station, but he knew this moment would come sooner or later. He was prepared for the consequences, or so he thought. John had always been a man of discipline. He had been in the Army for over a decade and had served in countless overseas missions. But nothing could have prepared him for the crushing weight of betrayal that had unfolded in the last few months. He had married Carla just a year ago, thinking she was his perfect match. But just 1 month into their marriage, his world had shattered. John had tested positive for HIV. The diagnosis had devastated him, especially because he was certain it hadn't come from his time serving overseas. His wife, Carla, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. A few weeks after their wedding, John found out that she had been seeing someone else, the man who had infected him with HIV. Carla's infidelity had turned his life upside down, and his heart had hardened with rage. That night, when Carla had stormed out of the house, John had been beside himself. The rage and betrayal had taken control. He had followed her, not fully realizing what he was doing until it was too late. He had run her down. As John sat in the interrogation room at the police station, the weight of his actions hit him harder than any enemy he had ever faced on the battlefield. The seasoned officer across from him, Detective Donovan, looked at him with cold, analytical eyes. "So, Lieutenant Simmons, what happened tonight?" Donovan began, his voice smooth but filled with an underlying tension. John stared back, his hands folded tightly in his lap, his jaw clenched, and he struggled to keep his composure. "It was an accident," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to. It wasn't supposed to happen like that." Donovan leaned in slightly. "Tell me about your relationship with Carla. Why did she leave the house tonight?" John looked up at the detective, his eyes narrowing. She didn't care about me anymore. I found out she was cheating on me, bringing some other man into our home. I couldn't take it. She gave me something. Something that's going to kill me. I was angry. I lost control. Donovan's mind clicked into place. So you're saying this was a result of your wife's infidelity? That she infected you with HIV? John nodded. Yes, she was the one who did this to me. I trusted her, and she betrayed me in the worst possible way. I wanted her to feel the pain I was feeling. That's all I could think about in the moment. I just wanted her to suffer. Detective Donovan knew this wasn't a simple case of revenge. It was a case of overwhelming betrayal that had led to deadly consequences. But something didn't add up. John's emotions were real, but Donovan could sense the emptiness in his eyes. The soldier in front of him wasn't just a man who had lost control. There was something more, something he was hiding. As Donovan delved deeper into the investigation, he learned of the secret that had been buried for months. Carla's infidelity wasn't the only thing that had been eating away at John. He had been diagnosed with HIV a month after their wedding. But why had he chosen to kill her instead of confronting her about the disease she had infected him with? Why had he resorted to running her down in the street instead of taking a more direct approach? Donovan's next steps were clear. He needed to understand the true nature of their relationship. There were no witnesses to the crash, and only John's word to go by. But Donovan wasn't convinced. He knew there was more to this than just a wife's betrayal and a soldier's fury. The investigation had just begun, and Donovan could feel the web of lies starting to unravel. The more he uncovered, the darker the story became. Was John truly the victim of a cruel betrayal, or had he planned this murder from the start? Donovan would need to dig deeper into their marriage, their past, and the twisted circumstances that led to that fateful night. One thing was clear. This was no ordinary case, and the truth, no matter how painful, was waiting to be discovered. Detective James Donovan sat at his desk, surrounded by piles of paperwork and evidence that had yet to be fully examined. The case had taken a darker turn than he had anticipated. On the surface, the death of Carla Simmons seemed like a tragic accident, a result of a heated confrontation between a husband and wife. But Donovan wasn't buying it. His instincts told him there was something much more sinister at play. He had already interviewed Lieutenant John Simmons, but his cold demeanor and vague answers left Donovan with more questions than answers. How had the man who swore to protect others ended up in this twisted mess? Why had John not confronted his wife about her infidelity before resorting to violence? Why the car? Why the street, where Carla had no chance of survival? Donovan flipped through the police report again, the images of the crime scene fresh in his mind. Carla's body had been found just yards away from their home, where she had been walking alone. The car that struck her was registered to John Simmons, but there was nothing to suggest it had been intentionally tampered with. The evidence was sketchy at best. But Donovan wasn't convinced. He needed more. He needed to understand the history behind this marriage. What had led them to this point of devastation? The first person Donovan decided to speak with was Carla's best friend, Marissa. She had been close to Carla for years and was devastated by her death. She knew Carla's life better than anyone, and Donovan was hoping she could shed some light on the darker corners of their relationship. Marissa lived a few miles away in a modest apartment, and when Donovan arrived at her door, she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were red from crying, and she seemed on edge. The shock of Carla's death was still too fresh for her to process fully. "Detective Donovan, she started, her voice shaking. "I can't believe she's gone. Carla didn't deserve this." Donovan nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "I know this is hard, Marissa, but I need to ask you some questions about Carla and her marriage to John. Anything you can tell me will help." Marissa hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't know how much I can help, but I'll try." Donovan sat down across from her, keeping his tone calm. "Tell me about Carla and John. Was their relationship always this difficult?" Marissa sighed and shook her head. "Carla was never happy. I don't think she ever really loved him the way he loved her. John was always gone, and Carla spent so much time alone. She told me a lot of things, but most of it was about how isolated she felt. John was distant, emotionally unavailable. He had these moments of coldness, you know. Like he wasn't fully there, even when he was physically present. Donovan jotted down notes. Did she ever mention anything about infidelity? Maybe an affair or something she might have been involved in? Marissa froze. She looked down at her hands, clearly uncomfortable. I I think she was seeing someone. I'm not sure who, but she did mention a few times that she wasn't happy with John, that she needed to feel alive again. She said she felt trapped, like she was suffocating. And then a few weeks ago, she told me something that, well, it was shocking. Donovan's ears perked up. What did she say? She said John wasn't the same man she married. She said she had gotten something from him, something that changed everything, Marissa said, voice barely above a whisper. She was scared. She said it wasn't something that could be undone. Donovan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This was the piece he had been missing. What do you mean by something that couldn't be undone? Was she talking about an illness? Marissa nodded, her face pale. Yes. She told me she had infected him. She didn't use the word HIV directly, but it was clear what she meant. She said she didn't want to keep it a secret anymore, but she was terrified of what would happen if he found out she'd betrayed him. She was looking for a way to leave him, but she didn't know how. Donovan felt the weight of the words sink in. Carla had confessed to her best friend about infecting her husband with HIV, but why would she do such a thing? And why hadn't she confronted John directly about it? The twisted logic of betrayal and revenge was starting to make more sense, but it still didn't explain why John had reacted so violently. Donovan decided it was time to dig deeper into John Simmons' past, specifically his military history. There had to be something there that could explain his extreme reaction to his wife's infidelity. He made a call to the Army's personnel office, requesting information on John's service record. It didn't take long before Donovan received the details he needed. John had served multiple tours overseas, including deployments in high-conflict areas where he had witnessed and experienced trauma. According to his file, he had received several commendations for bravery, but there were also reports of anger management issues. During his most recent tour, John had been involved in a serious altercation with a fellow soldier, which had nearly led to a court-martial. The incident had been brushed under the rug with a quiet discharge and a recommendation for psychological counseling. This information painted a picture of a man who had lived a life filled with stress, trauma, and unresolved anger. It wasn't hard to imagine that the pressures of his job, combined with the discovery of his wife's betrayal, had pushed him to the breaking point. Back at the station, Donovan reviewed the surveillance footage from the night of the crash. There was a camera at a nearby intersection, and it had captured a portion of the events leading up to Carla's death. The video showed her walking down the street, a figure of distress, as the car came into view. The car was traveling at a high speed, much faster than was typical for the area. The footage cut off before the impact, but Donovan knew the car had been intentionally aimed at her. This wasn't a case of a husband losing control in a moment of rage. It was calculated. John had driven after her with purpose, his mind likely clouded by the toxic mix of betrayal and revenge. But there was still more to uncover. Donovan's gut told him that John's story didn't fully add up. Was the crash really just a spur-of-the-moment decision, or had it been something he had planned from the start? Donovan's phone buzzed, snapping him from his thoughts. It was the lab results. The tox screen on Carla's body had just come back, and there was something unexpected. A high concentration of benzodiazepines, an anti-anxiety medication, was found in her system. This wasn't a typical overdose, but it was clear she had been sedated. Donovan sat back, his mind racing. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the puzzle was far from complete. Was it possible that Carla hadn't been walking away from her marriage in a moment of defiance, but instead had been drugged by John, perhaps to make her more vulnerable? Had he used the drug to keep her in a state of confusion, luring her into a deadly confrontation? As the investigation continued, one thing was certain. The truth behind Carla's death was more complicated than anyone could have imagined. Detective James Donovan's mind raced as the new evidence came in. The tox screen results on Carla Simmons had revealed something startling: a large amount of benzodiazepines in her system. This wasn't an accidental overdose. Someone had deliberately drugged her. But who? And why? The possibility that John Simmons, her husband, had drugged her before running her down started to look more likely by the second. But Donovan knew better than to jump to conclusions too quickly. He needed to dig deeper into Carla and John's relationship. If Carla had been drugged, it wasn't just a momentary lapse of judgment. It suggested premeditation, a carefully orchestrated plan. John Simmons might have been more involved in his wife's death than he was letting on. The following morning, Donovan headed back to the Simmons home. It was time to confront John again, but this time Donovan had more than just questions. He had evidence. John was sitting in the living room, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He had been through the ringer since the night of the crash. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, and Donovan could see that the weight of guilt had begun to settle on his shoulders. But Donovan knew better than to assume guilt based on appearance alone. "Lieutenant Simmons," Donovan began, his voice calm but firm, "we've got some new information. We found benzodiazepines in Carla's system. A large amount, enough to impair her judgment." John stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "What does that have to do with me?" "We also found out she had been prescribed the medication," Donovan continued, leaning forward. "But here's the thing. Those pills weren't in her bottle. They were in a different container, and the amount she had taken was much higher than a normal dose." John's face drained of color. He sat back in his chair, the blood draining from his face. "I didn't do that to her. I didn't give her anything. I swear." Donovan studied him closely, watching for any sign of a lie. "But you're saying you didn't drug her?" "I didn't," John repeated, his voice quieter now. "She was upset. She was angry with me. I never wanted any of this to happen." Donovan paused. He was getting closer. John's body language was starting to crack. His nervous energy was evident, but there was something else. A sense of deflection, like he was trying to cover up something. "Did Carla ever tell you she was planning to leave you?" Donovan asked. He already knew the answer, but he wanted to hear it from John. "Yes," John muttered, his eyes now fixed on the floor. "She said she was unhappy. She said I wasn't the man she married. But I loved her. I tried everything. I even tried to change, but she couldn't forgive me." Donovan noted the bitterness in his voice, a sense of resentment that had been building for some time. "So, when Carla stormed out of the house that night, what happened next?" John's hands fidgeted with the sleeve of his shirt, a nervous tic that Donovan had noticed earlier. "I followed her. I just wanted to talk. She wouldn't listen. She kept walking, and I just—" "Did you chase her down?" Donovan interjected. "Did you intentionally hit her with the car?" John hesitated, his fingers trembling. He wasn't sure how to answer. "I didn't mean to hit her. I lost control. She was walking so fast and I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to hurt her, but I couldn't stop myself. When I saw her there, I was filled with so much anger. She had betrayed me. She gave me something that I can't get rid of, and I just snapped." Donovan felt his gut twist. It was the same story John had told him earlier, but this time it felt rehearsed. He was missing something, and Donovan knew that he needed to push harder. "You're telling me that this wasn't intentional, that it was a result of anger, but the toxicology report shows that Carla was impaired before the crash. She was sedated. How do you explain that?" John's eyes flickered, his mind clearly racing. He looked around the room trying to find an escape from the question. "I don't know. Maybe she took something to calm herself down. She was always anxious, always on edge." Donovan wasn't convinced. Carla didn't just take something. Someone gave it to her. And it wasn't just anxiety medication. It was a powerful sedative, enough to make her vulnerable and confused. "You're telling me you didn't give it to her?" John's silence was damning. He refused to meet Donovan's eyes, and his hands were now shaking uncontrollably. It was the kind of reaction that told Donovan the truth. John knew exactly what had happened. "Lieutenant Simmons," Donovan pressed, "you need to be honest with me. Did you drug her? Did you plan this?" John closed his eyes, his face contorting in pain. It was as though the weight of his actions was finally hitting him. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to kill her. I swear I didn't want her dead." but I couldn't stand what she had done to me. She gave me a disease and it was eating away at me. I couldn't live with the idea of her moving on, of her getting away with it. I just wanted her to feel what I was feeling. Donovan leaned forward, his voice unwavering. But you made the decision to end her life, didn't you? You drugged her, followed her, and ran her down in cold blood. And now she's gone, and you're still lying about it. John's eyes welled up with tears, but Donovan wasn't moved. His job wasn't to pity the suspect, it was to uncover the truth. And the truth was clear. John Simmons had intentionally killed his wife in a fit of rage, manipulated by his own feelings of betrayal, shame, and vengeance. The investigation had taken a sharp turn. With John's confession in hand, Donovan needed to build the case against him. He'd already gathered significant evidence to support the claim that John had drugged Carla, and his confession, though reluctant, solidified the narrative of premeditated murder. Donovan knew he needed to act fast. The sooner they could arrest John, the sooner the community could begin to heal from the shock of Carla's death. But even as he prepared for the arrest, Donovan's mind lingered on one question. What had really driven John to this point of no return? Later that day, Donovan spoke to the local district attorney. I think we have enough to move forward. John Simmons is guilty of premeditated murder. We need to make an arrest. The DA agreed, but there was a lingering doubt in Donovan's mind. Had John acted alone, or had someone else been pulling the strings from the shadows? There was more to this story. Donovan was sure of it, and he wasn't going to rest until he uncovered every last detail. The arrest of Lieutenant John Simmons sent shockwaves through the small town of Leland, Ohio. What had once seemed like a tragic accident was now an open and shut case of premeditated murder. Or so it seemed. But Detective James Donovan's instincts told him that there was more to the story than the surface-level confession. There were too many gaps, too many unanswered questions. Simmons had admitted to drugging his wife and running her down in a moment of rage, but Donovan wasn't convinced that the case was as clear-cut as it appeared. There was something about the way Simmons had confessed, the way he spoke about Carla and his actions that night. That didn't sit right. It wasn't just guilt. It was a carefully crafted narrative, a story designed to fit the pieces of a puzzle. But some pieces were still missing. Donovan decided to revisit the evidence with a fresh perspective. He took another look at Carla's toxicology report, the prescription medication she had been taking, and the circumstances surrounding the accident. The benzodiazepines in her system were undeniably significant. But why had Carla taken such a high dose? It was possible that she had taken them herself, but the idea that she'd taken them voluntarily seemed unlikely, especially considering the state of panic she'd been in, according to Marissa. Donovan couldn't help but think someone had pushed her into a state of submission. He needed more than just circumstantial evidence. He needed to know exactly how Carla had been drugged, and most importantly, who had been behind it. The next morning, Donovan returned to the Simmons residence, hoping to find something new in the home, a clue that might have been overlooked. The house was still eerily quiet. He had already searched through most of the rooms during the initial investigation, but this time, he would focus on the small details, the things most people would miss. He started in the kitchen, going through the cabinets, the medicine cabinet, and the fridge. It was there, among the cluttered bottles of vitamins and half-used prescriptions, that he found something odd, a bottle of sleeping pills, a different prescription than the one Carla had been taking. The label was partially torn, but enough remained to show it was a powerful sedative, far stronger than any anxiety medication. The bottle was nearly empty. The pills inside were identical to those found in Carla's system. Donovan's heart raced as he realized what this meant. Someone had been hiding this sedative, perhaps even using it to control Carla. The thought of John Simmons administering it didn't seem far-fetched, but there was a nagging doubt at the back of Donovan's mind. Was it possible that someone else had been involved? Later that day, Donovan met with the district attorney, Susan Turner. She was eager to move forward with the case, but Donovan's hesitation was evident. I know John Simmons confessed, but I'm not entirely convinced we have the whole story, Donovan said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence, but something about the way he spoke during the interview doesn't add up. He seemed too rehearsed, too controlled. I think he's hiding something. Turner raised an eyebrow. You think someone else was involved? I don't know, Donovan replied, his eyes narrowing in thought. But I found something today. Another prescription. A bottle of sleeping pills. Far stronger than what Carla had been taking. It was almost empty, and it doesn't make sense that Carla would have been the one to take them. Turner leaned back in her chair, considering the new information. So, you think John wasn't acting alone? I'm not sure yet, Donovan said. But I have a theory. What if John didn't drug Carla on his own? What if someone else was feeding him information, manipulating him, convincing him that Carla needed to be controlled? It's possible that someone else was orchestrating everything from behind the scenes. Turner sighed, rubbing her temples. This is a mess, Donovan. But if someone else was involved, we need to find them. We can't let Simmons get away with murder. But we also need to be sure we're not overlooking something bigger. Donovan nodded. I'm going back to the Simmons house. I'll search for anything that might point to another person involved. That night, Donovan returned to the Simmons residence, this time with a fresh set of eyes. As he combed through the house once more, his mind racing, he stumbled upon something that sent a chill down his spine. In a drawer near the bedroom, hidden beneath a stack of old receipts and unopened bills, he found a small, inconspicuous envelope. It was addressed to John Simmons, but there was no return address. Donovan opened it carefully, revealing a single sheet of paper. It was a letter, written in a neat but unfamiliar handwriting. The letter read, John, I know you've been struggling with Carla's betrayal. You've suffered more than anyone can imagine, but you don't have to suffer alone. The things she's done to you, they're unforgivable. You don't need to let her get away with it. If you want peace, if you want justice, you need to do what's necessary. I can help you. You just need to follow the plan. Carla won't be able to resist, and once you've dealt with her, everything will be better. Just trust me, and I'll make sure you're free of her for good. Rakam. Donovan stared at the letter, his stomach sinking. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. Whoever this R was, they had been actively encouraging John to take drastic, violent action against his wife. It wasn't just an accident. It was manipulation, premeditated from the start. John had been pushed into this. Someone else had been pulling the strings. The next day, Donovan met with his team to discuss the new lead. The letter had been a breakthrough, but it raised more questions. Who was R? Was it someone close to John, or an outsider who had infiltrated his life? Donovan's mind kept going back to the phrase, if you want peace, if you want justice. It seemed to imply a twisted sense of righteousness. Whoever R was, they believed they were doing the right thing, even though they were inciting murder. He had one lead left to follow, the letter itself. He immediately sent it off to handwriting experts, hoping they could match it to a known source. But Donovan was cautious. The person behind this letter had gone to great lengths to manipulate John, and they might still be lurking in the shadows. As Donovan continued to work on the case, he realized that this was far from over. There were still too many unknowns, too many possibilities. John Simmons might have been the one who physically killed Carla, but someone else had orchestrated it all. Someone who knew exactly how to exploit John's vulnerabilities and manipulate his rage. But Donovan was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how twisted it became. The investigation had entered a critical phase. Detective James Donovan knew that the case wasn't going to be as straightforward as it had originally seemed. John Simmons, now in custody, had confessed to the murder of his wife, Carla. But there was a darker truth hiding beneath the surface, a truth that pointed to someone else manipulating the situation from behind the scenes. The mysterious R was the key, but finding out who they were was proving to be a difficult puzzle. Donovan had already sent the letter that John had hidden in his drawer to handwriting experts. He hoped it would provide a lead, but for now it was just another piece of a growing web of deceit. The more Donovan dug into the case, the more he felt the presence of a shadowy figure guiding John's every move, pushing him further into a corner until he had no choice but to kill. But who was R, and how far did their reach extend? 2 days had passed since the discovery of the letter, and Donovan had been working around the clock. He had spent hours reviewing the rest of the evidence, John's medical records, phone logs, and Carla's social media. but nothing had led him closer to identifying ERR. However, a breakthrough came when he received the handwriting analysis report. The handwriting experts had found something. It wasn't a perfect match, but there were strong similarities between the handwriting in the letter and the signature of someone who had been close to John Simmons in the past. A name appeared on the report that Donovan hadn't expected. Ryan Avery. Ryan Avery. Donovan had heard that name before. Avery was a former military buddy of John Simmons. The two had served together in the same unit during their time in the Army. Avery had been discharged after a violent altercation with another soldier, and his whereabouts had been unknown ever since. He'd been out of the military for years, but Donovan's gut told him that Avery was far from disconnected from John's life. Donovan immediately ordered a search for Ryan Avery. He wasn't sure if Avery was the person behind the letter, but the connection between him and John was too strong to ignore. If anyone knew how to push John's buttons, it would be a man who had spent years in close quarters with him. The letter's mention of justice and peace seemed to echo a military mentality, one that Avery likely still held on to, albeit in a twisted, vengeful form. Donovan headed to the nearest military base where Ryan Avery had once been stationed, hoping to find some trace of his former comrade. After speaking with military officials, Donovan learned that Avery had been dishonorably discharged 5 years ago and had since vanished from any official records. But a bit of digging into the more obscure places led Donovan to a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of Leland. It was a quiet area. Too quiet almost. The kind of place where someone trying to stay out of sight might live. Donovan knocked on the door of Avery's apartment. No one answered at first, so he knocked again, this time louder. He didn't expect Avery to be cooperative, but he hoped for some kind of response. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing a man in his mid-30s. He had a hardened look in his eyes, a sharpness that spoke of someone who had seen too much. The tattoos on his arms, military insignia and others that marked his time in service, were a reminder of his violent past. This was Ryan Avery. "Can I help you?" Avery asked, his voice low and cautious. Donovan didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I'm Detective James Donovan. I'm investigating a murder. Carla Simmons. I believe you knew her husband, John Simmons." Avery's expression hardened at the mention of John's name, his eyes narrowing. "I don't know anything about that. I haven't seen John in years." "You were in the same military unit," Donovan pressed. "You two were close. Very close, from what I've been told. I think you're the person who wrote a letter encouraging John to kill his wife." Avery stiffened. For a moment it looked like he might slam the door in Donovan's face, but then he stepped aside, allowing the detective to enter. "Come in," Avery muttered. "Let's talk." Donovan entered the dimly lit apartment, his eyes scanning the room. The space was sparse, just a few chairs, a small table, and piles of paperwork scattered across the floor. There was a smell of stale cigarettes and something else Donovan couldn't quite place, but it made his skin crawl. "Why would you get involved in something like this?" Donovan asked, keeping his voice even. "You don't know Carla Simmons. You have no reason to harm her. Why manipulate John like that?" Avery took a deep breath, walking over to a table covered with old photographs. He picked up a framed picture of himself and John, both in military uniforms, smiling and holding rifles. It was from the time they had served together in Afghanistan. "I know John," Avery finally said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "We went through hell together. We were family in a way that no one else could understand. But after I got out of the Army, everything changed. I was discharged dishonorably. I came back here to Leland, hoping for some kind of normal life. But you know what happened? John, he got everything. The career, the wife, the house, and I was left to rot. No one cared about me. No one wanted me around." Donovan's mind started to connect the dots. "So you resented John. You wanted him to feel your pain." Avery's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "I didn't just want him to feel my pain. I wanted him to know what it was like to lose everything, to have the world turn its back on you. I saw how he had everything, and I just couldn't stand it. I wanted to remind him that life doesn't always go the way you want it. I didn't want him to kill her, not exactly. But when I found out about Carla's affair, I saw my chance. I knew how to push John's buttons." "You manipulated him," Donovan said quietly. Yeah, Avery said, his voice cold. I told him she betrayed him, that she was using him. I gave him the pills, the idea that he could make everything right by taking control. I made him feel justified, made him believe that he wasn't the only one suffering. And when I saw he was spiraling, I pushed him harder. I told him he had to act, that Carla had to pay for what she'd done to him. Donovan felt a surge of disgust. And when he killed her, you disappeared. You let him take the fall. Avery shrugged. He was weak. He did what I couldn't. He made her pay, and now he's the one locked up, not me. Donovan's heart raced as he processed the confession. Avery had carefully manipulated John into a corner, using his vulnerabilities against him until he'd pushed him to murder. And now Avery thought he was untouchable, free to walk away without consequences. But Donovan wasn't done yet. You're under arrest for your involvement in the murder of Carla Simmons, Donovan said, his voice firm as he reached for his handcuffs. Avery's face twisted in rage, but it was too late. Donovan had him. The webs of deceit were starting to unravel, and the mastermind behind Carla's death was finally in custody. Detective James Donovan sat in the interrogation room, his hands folded on the table as Ryan Avery glared at him from across the steel desk. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on Avery's face, making the sweat on his forehead more pronounced. He had been in custody for less than 2 hours, and already the walls were closing in on him. Donovan had been in this job long enough to know when a suspect was cracking. Avery had been cool and collected when they arrested him, even arrogant, but now with the weight of his manipulation exposed and the murder pinned on him as much as on John Simmons, he was starting to unravel. You think you're smart, Avery spat, his fingers tapping in anxious rhythm on the table, but you don't have anything concrete on me. Donovan smirked, flipping open the case file in front of him. I have more than you think, he said, sliding a document across the table. This is the forensic analysis of the letter you sent John, the one telling him to restore his honor. The handwriting is a match to your old military records. You practically signed your name on his downfall. Avery's jaw clenched. So what? A letter doesn't prove I killed her. Donovan leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. No, but it proves intent. You planted the idea in John's head. You knew exactly how broken he was, and you used that against him. And when the time came, you let him take the blame while you walked away clean. That makes you just as guilty as if you had run her over yourself. Avery shook his head, his nostrils flaring as he tried to suppress his frustration. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. Donovan watched as his fingers twitched, his leg bouncing under the table. He was close to cracking. You want to hear something funny? Donovan continued, his voice now lower, almost conspiratorial. John is already talking. He's in the next room with my partner, spilling everything. You think he's going to take the fall for you? Think again. He's naming you as the reason he did it. Avery's eyes flickered with something close to panic. He sat back in his chair, crossing his arms tightly across his chest. He wouldn't do that, he muttered. John's a soldier. He knows about loyalty. Donovan nodded. Yeah, he does. But he also knows when he's been played. You weren't his friend, Avery. You were his puppet master, pulling the strings to get your revenge for whatever twisted grudge you were holding. And now, the game's over. Avery swallowed hard, his confidence slipping. The silence stretched between them like a noose tightening around his neck. Donovan pressed on. Here's what's going to happen. You can sit here and let John's confession bury you, or you can tell me the truth right now, and maybe, just maybe, I can cut you a deal. But the clock is ticking, Avery. What's it going to be? Avery's breathing grew heavy. His eyes darted toward the one-way mirror on the wall, as if hoping for some unseen ally to intervene. But there was no one coming to save him. He had spent years living in the shadows, pulling strings from a distance. Now, for the first time, the strings were being cut. He exhaled sharply and leaned forward. Fine, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll talk. Donovan didn't move, didn't celebrate. He simply opened his notebook and pressed record. Start from the beginning, he said. Tell me everything. 3 hours later, with Avery's confession recorded and signed, Donovan walked out of the interrogation room, feeling the weight of the case finally beginning to lift. He had spent the last few hours pulling every detail out of Avery, how he had followed Carla, how he had discovered her affair, and how he had slowly planted the idea of revenge into John's fragile mind. Avery had never expected things to spiral as they did. He had wanted John to hurt, to suffer, but he hadn't anticipated that his manipulations would lead to outright murder. In the end, he had played with fire and burned himself in the process. As Donovan stepped into the observation room, his partner, Detective Lisa Carter, was waiting for him. "You got him to break," she said, arms crossed. Donovan nodded. "Yeah, he admitted everything. He pushed John to the edge, knew exactly how to make him snap." Carter exhaled, shaking her head. "Sick bastard." Donovan leaned against the desk, rubbing his temples. John Simmons may have been the one behind the wheel, but Avery was the real killer in this case. He knew what he was doing. He just didn't expect us to put the pieces together. Carter smirked. "Well, he underestimated you. Not the first guy to make that mistake." Donovan chuckled, but the exhaustion was setting in. This case had been one of the darkest he had ever worked, not because of the crime itself, but because of the layers of manipulation and betrayal woven into it. "Let's get the paperwork done," Donovan said. "I want this bastard locked up before he tries to weasel his way out." Carter nodded. "I'll call the DA." As she left the room, Donovan took one last look through the one-way mirror. Avery sat slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the table, his hands cuffed in front of him. He had spent years pulling strings, controlling others from the shadows, but now he was the one with no control. Justice had caught up with him, and Donovan was finally ready to close the book on this case. Detective James Donovan sat in the courtroom, watching as the judge entered and took his seat. The tension in the air was thick, the kind that always lingered before a verdict was read. Across the room, Ryan Avery sat with his defense attorney, his face blank, but his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. He had been confident when this trial started, but after the overwhelming evidence presented against him, his arrogance had been chipped away, leaving only a hollow shell of the manipulator he once was. John Simmons sat at a separate table, dressed in a prison-issued jumpsuit. Unlike Avery, he looked resigned. His confession had given the prosecution everything they needed to secure a conviction, but it had also given him a shot at a reduced sentence. He had pleaded guilty to manslaughter, admitting to running Carla over in a blind rage. But what sealed Avery's fate was John's testimony, how Avery had fed his paranoia, planted the idea of revenge, and manipulated him into committing the crime. The judge cleared his throat, silencing the murmurs in the courtroom. After reviewing all the evidence and testimonies provided, this court finds Ryan Avery guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and second-degree murder. Avery stiffened. His attorney whispered something to him, but his eyes remained locked on the judge. "You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole," the judge declared. "This court finds your actions reprehensible. You preyed on a man's vulnerability and orchestrated the murder of an innocent woman. Justice will be served." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Avery's face finally cracked. His lips parted as if he wanted to argue, but no words came out. The sound of the gavel hitting the desk sealed his fate. Donovan let out a slow breath, the weight of the case finally lifting. He had chased killers before, but there was something uniquely disturbing about this one. Avery hadn't needed to pull the trigger or drive the car. He had killed Carla with his words, his manipulations, his careful and deliberate destruction of another man's life. As Avery was escorted out in handcuffs, Donovan caught his eye. The former soldier's expression twisted in rage, but there was something else there too. Defeat. John Simmons' sentencing followed soon after. The judge acknowledged the emotional torment he had suffered, but also made it clear that taking a life could not go unpunished. He was sentenced to 25 years, with the possibility of parole after 15. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was justice. Outside, the courthouse. The press swarmed the steps of the courthouse, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. Donovan ignored them as he walked past, focused only on getting to his car. Lisa Carter caught up with him. "You did it," she said. We did it, Donovan corrected. Couldn't have cracked Avery without you, she smirked. Well, at least now we can finally close this case. Donovan looked up at the sky. It was a rare sunny day, a stark contrast to the darkness they had spent months unraveling. Yeah, he said. Case closed. As he got into his car, he took one last look at the courthouse. Another case in the books. Another criminal taken down. The job wasn't always easy, but today justice had won, and that was enough.